So obviously, the World Cup that's still taking place right now has been mired in controversy. So we've had, allegations of corruption in FIFA around the decision to award the hosting of the World Cup to Qatar. We've then obviously had the major questions and concerns that have been raised about Qatar's human rights record. What do you make of the decision making behind all this?
Oh, I mean, yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? It's obviously like you, I'm sort of gutted about what happened yesterday, but we can park that for now for Gareth Southgate and the boys. I think we saw going back to when that decision was made. This is obviously don't know how well people will remember, but this is the one that we were also bidding for, and going back to sort of Sepp Blatter's involvement at that time, it stank to high heaven when this decision was made. I think, we saw the sort of the idea of an event like the World Cup is that it creates these sort of legacy venues. It helps kind of revive maybe part of a city or part of a country, or many cities within a country, to kind of bring them up as with the Olympic Games and other big sporting events. And I think there wasn't a strong case for this event to be held in Qatar. I think at the time as well, the considerations around weather and everything weren't even brought in. So it was sometime after the decision was made that it was decided to move it to the winter, because it was going to be an absolute disaster to hold it in the summer when it's normally held. And then obviously we've just seen a whole catalogue of issues around, the way the Qatari government operates, in terms of, freedom of expression and gay rights and women's rights and all sorts of issues that are completely incoherent with FIFA. But I kind of say that, but then you actually look at what we heard from FIFA, they seem to think it's all fine anyway. So, well, not the whole body, but like the key people, which is quite shocking to hear sort of that bizarre speech we heard from, I forgot the guy's name now, the president of FIFA, which was quite a shock. So, the decision making has been really difficult. Obviously, this is also coming on the back of Russia as a World Cup venue, which again I thought was obviously a very strange decision. And I think we saw sort of the power of sports washing. We saw Russia sort of legitimizing themselves on the world stage. So there's all sorts of difficulties here that are a real shame. And I think that sort of last minute thing as well of the players not even being able to express their sort of feelings through wearing an armband or anything like that. We saw FIFA sort of threatening to kind of break all protocol really, and sort of talk about giving players yellow cards, which I think is something they're not. Yeah, that's never been done before, like for something you're wearing. So it's bit of a mess and a bit of a shame. A lot of a shame.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on something I think really important there. The last World Cup was held by Russia, and now Russia is as pariah a state as it's possible to be following its invasion of Ukraine. We've now seen Qatar hosting this World Cup, and you've talked about there the fact that players have been essentially prevented from making any political statements in relation to the Qatari regime, which it seemed that a lot of them wanted to do through the wearing of armbands and so on. This though is just, I think, one of the kind of big major problems that there is right now in sort of top flight football. So we've got other issues, like if you look at club football in England, you have the eye-watering salaries and transfer fees that are getting ever bigger. That they're sums that you can't really even imagine or understand how big they are. You have some English clubs having been taken over by Russian oligarchs or by some particularly unsavory states over the last few years. The controversies around FIFA and the allocation of the World Cup is one problem, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's currently going wrong when it comes to top flight football. You're the Green Party spokesperson on these issues around sport. How would the Green Party tackle these kinds of issues that are pervasive across top flight football?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different things here, and kind of as you've sort of articulated there, Chris. I think there's really a lot to disentangle. It's there are so many things that need to be happening at all different levels of the game, and it's not just football. Of course, we're seeing similar problems happening. Top flight rugby is in a kind of similar but slightly different situation where the sort of different various business interests have got involved, and because they've turned these sports clubs into businesses, as you may know, I think we're now two, maybe three clubs going, well, two have gone bankrupt in Premiership rugby and in rugby union, this is. So, yeah, we're seeing like all sorts of problems in terms of how private interests get involved in sport and how they take the sport away from kind of the community, like the fans. You know, I mean, the best example probably, well, actually, no, not even the best example anymore, but a very good one that I remember being extremely controversial was when Manchester United was floated on the New York Stock Exchange, which kind of really is kind of the epitome of how much we're taking this club away from where it's from. Like, it doesn't make any sense at all. So, in terms of what the Green Party would do, I mean, there's a hell of a lot that needs to change. We've got really great policy actually on sport. And for people who are interested, if you go to policy.greenparty.org.uk, you can have a look through. And it's our policies in this area, I think, are more developed than people might imagine. In fact, certainly for me, joining the party and getting involved in, you know, the broad culture, media, sport brief, it's actually, yeah, it was very exciting for me to actually read through all these, you know, all the thinking that's already gone on. And we are doing a rewrite. So I will give a quick plug to the Culture, Media and Sport Policy Working Group, because we're just kicking off at the moment on an update. I say a rewrite. It's not because it's not good, but it's the culture policy we currently have was last written in 2007. Well, sorry, it had its last major update in 2007. Its last update of any variety in 2014. So there's some stuff to do here, but with those caveats included. One of the things we want to see at the sort of club level, at the kind of lower level, is much more involvement of local authorities within sport. And this kind of cuts again to the much bigger picture in which we're operating, because the austerity agenda is reducing the ability for local authorities to do anything. You know, I'm a councillor on a local authority, and the idea that we can have any involvement in our grassroots sports clubs feels quite fanciful, to be honest, because, you know, we're looking at some very bleak decisions and a very bleak future right now with the situation we have in terms of, you know, 30-40% cuts to local government in the last 12 years. But what the Green Party would obviously like to see through national measures is much more support for local authorities, and therefore much more support through local authorities for sports clubs. I think it's worth pointing out that within the culture and sport brief, like, if you compare the two, sport is a much more private entity, kind of as a broad, as a sort of broad discipline, whereas there is, you know, we're seeing a lot more happening with the Arts Council funding at the moment with regard to culture. Sports England is a similar kind of awarding body to the Arts Council England. Sorry, I should also point out there are the other devolved bodies in Wales as well, which obviously we cover. But like, Sport England is much less directly involved in the provision of kind of sport than the Arts Council, for example. So there isn't as much control there because there's already so much more kind of private money operating. And in some ways that's good, because like what that can mean is that some sports clubs are more resilient because they aren't just relying on state funding. But obviously it can also mean that lots of other clubs will really struggle because there is no net. There's no net like you currently have with the Arts Council, except when the net gets removed, as it has done obviously with ENO and various other organisations. But we won't get into culture for now. But so yeah, we want to see much more support there. And I think a big change as well for us is that the Green Party policy, like a core idea for both culture and sport, is that we want these to be about active participation and less about passive consumption. And that's where, you know, we want far more inclusive clubs. There are some fantastic examples of clubs kicking off. I was at the BBC Radio Lancashire Make a Difference Awards recently, and we saw this fantastic club that it welcomes people of all different sizes, shapes, sexualities, genders, everything else. And they do, they're a mixed rugby club actually. So they do just that anyone can play, we all play together. It's not about being competitive, it's about engagement, community. That's fantastic, but these things shouldn't be one-off things we get excited about. This should be the norm in so many parts of the country, well, in all parts of the country. At the top flight level, the thing that I think is really important is making it much easier for supporters groups to actually take control of their clubs. So there's all sorts of ways at the moment in which that's really, really difficult. And with the money that's involved as well, we would like to see far more of these top flight clubs basically being community-owned mutuals, which I think is just such a great way of a club existing. It brings it right back to its grassroots. And we are seeing elements of this, and you see partial ownership through some community-owned mutuals, but supporting that and basically making it much more difficult for people to do what they've been doing to some of these clubs, and for the foreign interest to just completely take control of something for their own ends, to try to milk as much cash out of it as they can, and just turn as big a profit as they can.
So I'm going to come to questions in the chat in a moment. So please, anyone watching, please do get questions in there, and I'll put them to Jack. We've got a great one already about golf, which we'll come to in a moment or two. But yeah, that last point that you talked about around sort of fan ownership is a really interesting one, I think. And if I'm not mistaken, Barcelona is an example of this, where it's run as a cooperative, and I believe it's mostly fan owned, although there are criticisms of the structures there. But what does, you've talked about making it easier for fans to take ownership of their clubs. What does that look like in practice? What are the steps that are needed to make it easier for fan ownership to become a more dominant model in sport generally in the UK?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think at the moment, like the structures that we have for doing this, like there are all sorts of ways, for example, that you can avoid taxes through sort of sports ownership as an individual who's not resident in this country. So you can we've seen this through like the ways in which the Glazers have operated, ways in which they can even actually, the very fact that they can float Manchester United on the New York Stock Exchange is something that I think shouldn't be possible. And that's one of the things that makes this so difficult. So I think from my understanding of this, and I'm not sort of an expert on exactly how this can be done in practice, but I think it's more about the fact that it's so easy for people with a lot of money to keep these clubs out of community ownership. Than it is like the technical ways of doing it, like the way of building of creating a community organization, or it could be a community interest company, or there's all different structures. They're sort of there, and that's possible. But what the sort of money that you might be trying to raise in certain parts of the country to take a stake within your club are so high now, and that's where I think there is a place for regulation and to make it more difficult for these clubs to get involved. So there's all different ways that we have kind of restrictions on foreign investment in various forms of media, for example. Like we don't allow someone to just sort of take control of all different types of media. We have the whole controversy a little while ago with Rupert Murdoch and Sky and Sky News. So I think it's about regulating those things more, and maybe introducing new forms of taxation in some of the ways that people make money out of sporting clubs, and the way that they buy them. The way the cash can just come in from anywhere. We don't have very good controls in terms of where some of this money is coming from. We know some quite dirty money is potentially flowing in to some of these clubs, and I won't necessarily name the specific ones because I don't want to get in trouble myself. But yeah, you might know which ones I'm talking about. So I think that's where we could have more restrictions. We could have tighter regulation, and yeah, by making those things more difficult, we reduce the gap between potential community ownership. But I think there are other ways that we could support community ownership. There's all sorts of ways that that a government could provide vehicles ready for people to say, right, this is what you need to do, this is how it works, this is how you can raise the money, this is how many people you need to get to sign up, and create some sort of legally recognized way of easily doing this with our top flight clubs.
So I'm going to move away from sort of the broad sports sector and football in particular, and towards golf, because there's a really interesting question that's coming from Ben Samuel in the chat around golf courses. And I'm going to embellish the question a little bit, but golf courses are a point of particular controversy when it comes to sport. They are facilities which takes up huge amount of land, which are extremely environmentally intensive to maintain in terms of water, in terms of management of the grass and everything else. They are places which golf clubs are essentially privatization of land, and there are people, for example, like Donald Trump, who've historically bought up and owned lots of golf courses around Scotland and opened new ones and privatized more bits of land as a result of that. I don't really know where I'm going with this question, because the question that came in was just, can Jack talk about golf courses? And so I guess to put a question on it, what do you think the impact of golf as a sport is on the privatization of land, on environmental impacts and so on? But also, what do you think the example of golf tells us about a sport which is generally speaking, are preserved for an elite, and which leads to that kind of privatization of land and environmental impacts as well.
Yeah, I think kind of in the way actually you've sort of ended that like summing up that question. I think there's a broader point here, which is to do with the way that land ownership in this country works, the sort of historical land ownership. That's sort of the actual underlying problem, I think, which in a way sort of golf's an easy thing to sort of beat with a stick, but the system that supports it is actually sort of much broader, and this comes to even back to stuff that Caroline Lucas is currently working on in the Houses of Parliament in terms of a right to roam, public access to this land, and that's lots of the land that is currently blocked off to us mere plebs is land that is not necessarily golf courses, but golf courses form part of that. So I think there's this kind of issue in terms of how land is owned and how land is valued. Obviously, I think golf courses are a good example of something that would potentially be reformed through land value tax, something that the Green Party have obviously been talking about for a very long time now, and would be sort of priced more appropriately for the kind of value it's taking away from those that can't access it. But also potentially that would open up ways of opening up access to golf courses. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that some golf courses are quite cheap to play, and certainly I know in Scotland, I guess we think of golf potentially as being sort of maybe more class-based in England, but I know in Scotland it's not quite the same, and a lot of people who it's just an ordinary pastime. It's considered a more sort of normal thing to do, to go to the golf course, and lots of golf courses are very friendly. They've got very nice clubhouses, they're very cheap, they're very welcome to new players. So it's one of those things we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, we can't just sweep golf off the face of the earth. And I think again there are lots of golf courses that manage themselves in a much more environmentally friendly way. Like, it doesn't have to be as intensive as it sometimes is, especially when golf courses are in the right places. Like, there are parts of the country and types of land that are much more suited to being a golf course than others. And even thinking about somewhere like Qatar, it's the kind of place where you see golf courses in the middle of the desert. That's obviously the kind of place that's not a good place to have one. I'm not saying we have parts like that in the UK, but there are places where I think we have to put a lot more water, a lot more pesticides and everything else into trying to keep somewhere the way it should be. So, so having them in the appropriate places, I think, taxing land properly, which would kind of make it more difficult to operate golf courses in certain parts of the country where you are really sort of blocking it from the public. But similarly, you could tie into something like a land value tax, eases on that, depending on if you're opening your land to the public, so ways of making it more accessible. Lots of golf courses are open to, dog walkers and everything at certain hours. I know one, near where I used to live in Kendal, there was a golf course there that was very open, very public, very kind of friendly, and everyone could use it. So it's kind of shifting, I think, the mentalities of some of these places. Some of the elite areas, the elite clubs, I think, are the ones that maybe require the most focus in terms of opening them up, allowing more people to access that land. But it's a complicated one. The number that's completely escaped my head at the moment, because I wasn't thinking about golf, is how much of the land it takes up in this country. And I know it's an astonishing number, and I wish I had it off the top of my head. But I think, again, what you can see in some of these areas is that there are ways for these courses to be better managed and to have much more wildlife within them. They can have more like woodland between the actual the holes and everything else, like sort of more. See, there's all sorts you could do in terms of what we're asking farmers to do as well, and re-wiggling rivers and all this kind of thing. There's scope for that within golf courses. So making that something that they are rewarded for doing, I think is another example of how we can actually make them much more environmentally friendly. And some of the greatest golf courses in the world, of course, actually have some of these amazing natural obstacles. That's what people love about, someone like St Andrews. It is the sort of the natural rugged nature of it that is what makes it so appealing.
Sorry to put you on the spot there on golf, which I know you weren't expected to talk about. Before I let you leave, just a final kind of overarching question, which really is just, how would you describe the Green Party's vision for sport? So I think, I'll come back to that thing I did say earlier, because I think it's a real underlying point, and this applies to culture as well for us, is that we are about active participation and not passive consumption. And that doesn't mean that passive consumption in and of itself is a bad thing, but it's that I think at the moment so much of sport and culture are things that are sort of
done to you or things that you watch and not things necessarily that you do. I think there's such a broad spectrum of ways in which, you know, sport can be so good for communities. It's obviously very good for physical health. It's very good for mental health. But I think a lot of people feel that sports potentially are not that accessible. I think as well, like one sort of real difficulty we have in this country is that there is such a sort of massive dominance of football and a lack of sort of support and interest for other sports. And certainly, like, if you go to some of the elite schools in this country, you will be exposed to all these weird and wonderful sports that exist, but there tends to be far fewer opportunities for those within our comprehensive system. And I think it would be great to really open that up to more people. And I think we are seeing that, like, there are things happening through the Olympic Games, for example, lots more sports coming back in. And I would give a plug as well, as we've kind of talked about golf. I think it's really interesting to think about some of the sports that are, like, not necessarily that strenuous, but that once upon a time were considered very much a sport. You know, something like chess, which is a really, really enjoyable pastime. I'm quite a fan of chess. It is kind of coming back onto the radar now with Magnus Carlsen and all the controversies with this whole cheating scandal, and who knows what was happening with various types of implement, which we won't talk about. But I think, yeah, it's kind of, you know, chess back in the sort of 70s and 80s used to be televised. It used to be prime time. People got really into it. It was maybe because of the Cold War. Maybe it was one of the things that, like, supercharged that. It's but, you know, it also used to be in the Olympics. And I think the way the Olympics have become this kind of festival of more just like really elite athleticism, I think is a bit of a shame, because it's a physical athleticism. You know, I think it's great to try to open all these things up to a much broader audience and allow many more ways for people to engage in sport. So yeah, I think through the kind of general green feeling of anti-austerity and of, you know, pushing back against all the cuts we've had, you know, it's getting far more types of sport into schools, supporting schools to provide access to those sports, and providing far more grassroots support for those types of sports as well, so that we actually have people active, engaging in these sports, and hopefully we'll see, like, more happening. And as I say, I am happy, because I think it's easy also to lose track of how far we've come, and certainly the rise of, say, women's football has been really fantastic and really kind of opening up a whole different kind of perspective on it. And I think it's been really good it's been very positive for the culture of the men's game too. I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing a much more kind of compassionate and thoughtful approach to the men's game internationally through, you know, Gareth Southgate and Harry Kane. And, you know, there's a real toxicity that's kind of on the wane. And, you know, I think last night we heard sort of Gary Neville talking about that with the, you know, the penalty that Harry Kane missed. And, you know, we've got a kind of media, like, things are changing. And I think, but we want to obviously really, really double down on that, not be cutting back on the resources that schools have, which is obviously what we're doing right now, which is a disaster, frankly, for sport.